The call to duty. Samuel Reed had always prided himself on being a dedicated officer. For over 22 years, he had given his heart and soul to the Nashville Police Department. He had risen through the ranks with hard work, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Now, at 45 years old, he was a respected lieutenant colonel, one of the department's most trusted leaders. His career had provided a comfortable and secure life for his family, and he had always believed that the quiet, predictable rhythm of their lives would continue uninterrupted. The Reeds lived in a suburban neighborhood just outside Nashville, where the streets were lined with oak trees and the hum of suburban life filled the air. His wife, Vanessa, was a nurse at the local hospital, and their two teenage children, Tyler and Chloe, had grown up in the same area, attending the local schools and forging friendships that seemed destined to last a lifetime. Samuel loved the life they had built: weekend barbecues, family movie nights, and the occasional vacation to the coast. He had always dreamed of retiring here, watching his children grow into adulthood, and enjoying his golden years with Vanessa by his side. But that Monday morning, everything changed. Samuel sat in his office, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room as he reviewed reports from the previous week's operations. It was an ordinary day, nothing out of the ordinary. The phone rang, breaking the silence. Samuel glanced at the caller ID. It was Chief Marcus. A surge of curiosity and concern washed over him. Chief Marcus was a no-nonsense kind of man, and whenever he called, it was usually for something important. Lieutenant Colonel Reed. The chief's voice came through, his tone unusually serious. "We have a situation. I need you to come to my office right away." Samuel's mind began to race as he set down the report he was reading. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, trying to anticipate the nature of the situation. Was it a new case or something more urgent? He grabbed his hat and made his way to the chief's office. When he arrived, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, Chief Marcus was sitting behind his desk, his face grave. He motioned for Samuel to take a seat. There was an odd tension in the air, a heaviness that Samuel couldn't quite place. "Samuel," the chief began, his voice lower than usual, "we need you to lead a special operation in Stanton, Tennessee. The situation there is critical, and they've requested someone with your experience. The governor himself has personally signed off on the transfer. You're the right person for this job." The words hit Samuel like a cold wave. Stanton. He'd never even been to Stanton. It was a small rural town about 3 hours east of Nashville, nestled in the Appalachian foothills. He knew little about the area, and even less about why it needed such a high-ranking officer as him. "Wait a minute," Samuel said, his mind racing. "Stanton. But why? I've been in Nashville for over 2 decades. My family, my life, everything is here. I don't understand." The chief looked at him with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "I know this is sudden, Samuel, but this is a matter of national security. There's a growing problem in that area, and they need someone with your experience to lead the operation. It's a dangerous assignment, but it's crucial for the safety of the state. They want you to report immediately. This is a direct order from the governor." Samuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision sinking in. He had always put duty first, but this was different. His mind flashed to Vanessa, to his children. They were settled here. They were comfortable. And now, in a moment, that security could be shattered. The thought of uprooting them, of disrupting their lives, was almost unbearable. But he knew what he had to do. The call of duty was not something he could ignore. "I understand, sir," Samuel said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I'll get on it right away." The chief nodded, but his eyes betrayed a sense of regret. "I know this isn't easy, Samuel, but I have full faith in you. Just be safe." As Samuel left the office, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. He was a soldier first, always ready to answer the call when duty required it. But this was different. This wasn't just a professional decision, it was personal. His family was everything to him. The thought of tearing them away from the only life they had ever known weighed heavily on his heart. When he arrived home later that evening, he found Vanessa in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The soft scent of garlic and onions filled the air. Tyler and Chloe were in the living room, laughing at something on TV. The familiar sounds of home brought a fleeting sense of comfort, but the reality of what he was about to tell them loomed over him like a storm cloud. He walked into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy. Vanessa looked up at him, her warm smile faltering when she saw his expression. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked, sensing the tension in his posture. Samuel exhaled deeply. He had been preparing for this moment all day, but now that it was here, the words seemed impossible to say. He ran a hand through his hair and cleared his throat. "Vanessa," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to talk to you about something important." She set the knife down and walked over to him, concern written across her face. "What's going on, Samuel? You're scaring me." He hesitated for a moment, looking into her eyes. He could see the worry in them, the unspoken question. What was going on in his mind? Finally, he spoke the words that he knew would change everything. "I've been transferred to Stanton. I'm going to have to lead a special operation there." Vanessa's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Stanton? Why? What's going on?" Samuel took a deep breath. "I don't have all the details, but the situation there is critical. The governor personally asked for me to take charge of the operation. It's dangerous, Vanessa, but they need me there. They need someone with experience." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of his words settled in. Vanessa's face remained calm, but Samuel could see the conflict brewing beneath the surface. She was always supportive, always understanding. But this was different. This was an upheaval that neither of them had anticipated. "I don't know what to say, Samuel," Vanessa finally replied, her voice soft but steady. "This is a lot. The kids, they're settled here. We've built a life here. What does this mean for us? For the family?" Samuel swallowed hard. He knew how much they had sacrificed to create their life in Nashville. The thought of uprooting them, of pulling his children away from their friends, their schools, and everything they knew, was almost too much to bear. "I don't know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I have to go. Duty calls. I can't ignore it." Vanessa nodded slowly, a mix of pride and sadness in her eyes. "I understand. But we need to talk about this more. We need to figure out what's best for all of us." And so, the conversation began. But deep down, Samuel knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. The reluctant departure. The next few days passed in a blur of logistics, emotions, and countless questions. Samuel could hardly sleep at night, his mind constantly racing. The uncertainty of the future gnawed at him. Though Vanessa had been understanding, he could tell that she, too, was struggling with the weight of the decision. Tyler and Chloe, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the gravity of what was happening. They were busy with their own lives, sports, friends, school. But Samuel knew that their world was about to be upended in a way none of them could have prepared for. By the time the weekend rolled around, Samuel had barely had a moment to himself. The day had come to tell their children. Vanessa had insisted that they all sit down together and talk about what was happening. Samuel dreaded the moment, knowing how difficult it would be for his children to understand the abrupt shift in their lives. They were young, but not so young that they wouldn't feel the loss of everything they knew, their friends, their school, the house they'd grown up in. He had seen the small ways in which they thrived in their current environment, and now he was about to shatter it all. The evening was still and quiet. Tyler was lounging on the couch, his phone in hand, while Chloe was sketching something on her tablet at the kitchen table. Vanessa and Samuel had decided to break the news after dinner, when they could all sit down together and discuss the move. The tension in the air was palpable. "Kids, we need to talk," Samuel began, his voice low, gathering both of their attentions. He could see the confusion flicker in Tyler's eyes, and the way Chloe stopped mid-sketch, her brow furrowing in curiosity. Vanessa sat beside Samuel, her hand resting on his knee, offering him silent support. She could sense how hard this was going to be for him, but she knew the kids needed clarity. And most of all, they needed to know that whatever happened next, they would face it together. "What's going on, Dad?" Tyler asked, the casual tone of his voice quickly fading as he saw the seriousness in his father's eyes. Samuel took a deep breath. "I've been transferred to Stanton, Tennessee. It's a small town, and I'm going to be leading a special operation there. It's something I have to do, and I don't have a choice." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Chloe blinked a few times as if trying to process the words. Tyler looked back and forth between his parents, a sense of disbelief settling on his face. "Wait, transferred?" Chloe said slowly, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. "But what does that mean? Are we moving there?" "Yes," Samuel replied softly. "We'll be moving to Stanton. It's a big change, but it's something I have to do for my work. We'll figure it all out together, but I need you both to understand that this is something important." Vanessa looked at her children, her voice steady, but tinged with sadness. "I know this is a lot to take in, but we will make sure we're all okay. We'll make new memories, and we'll face this as a family." Tyler shook his head, standing up abruptly. "This doesn't make sense. Why Stanton? We're good here. Why do you have to go all the way out there? What's even in Stanton?" Samuel sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. "I don't have all the details, but there's a situation there that needs my help. It's a high-stakes operation, and I've been asked to lead it. I know it's hard, but sometimes we have to make sacrifices." Chloe set down her tablet and crossed her arms. "So we just leave everything? Friends, school, everything?" Her voice wavered as she tried to come to terms with the reality of the situation. "You said we'd be here for a long time. You promised." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. You promised. He had promised. He had always promised his children stability, a steady home, and now he was the one breaking that promise. The guilt gnawed at him, but he knew that, in the end, he was doing this because he believed it was the right thing. The sacrifice was necessary, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing them in some way. "I'm sorry, Chloe. I really am," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I wish things were different, but this is something I have to do, for all of us. This opportunity won't come again, and I can't ignore it. I know this isn't fair, and I know it hurts, but we'll make sure you're okay. We'll help you adjust, and we'll make sure you don't feel like you're losing everything." Tyler paced around the room, his frustration mounting. What if we don't like it? What if it's worse than here? What if we can't make new friends? Samuel stood up and walked over to his son, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "I know it's scary, but we're not going there alone. We're going together, as a family. And that's what matters most. You're not losing me or Mom. We're in this together." The conversation hung in the air, thick with emotion. Vanessa stepped in, her voice softer now, as she looked at both children. "We can't control everything, but we can control how we face it. And we will face this with strength and courage, just like we always have." The room was quiet for a long time. The weight of the conversation lingered, and Samuel could see that their children were still processing what they had been told. He understood their pain, he shared it, but he couldn't back down now. The following days were filled with a flurry of activity. Samuel packed his belongings, and Vanessa began looking into schools for Tyler and Chloe in Stanton. They had no choice but to embrace the change, despite how overwhelming it felt. The thought of leaving their home, their neighborhood, and everything they had known for the past several years was heartbreaking. But as the days slipped by, they realized that, as difficult as it was, this move was going to be inevitable. There was no turning back. On the last night in Nashville, Samuel sat on the porch, staring at the house they were about to leave behind. He thought about all the moments they had spent in this home. The late nights working in his office, the laughter of his children echoing through the halls, the quiet mornings when Vanessa would sit by his side with a cup of coffee, and they would talk about their dreams. This house had been their sanctuary, and now they were saying goodbye. Vanessa joined him outside, her presence a quiet comfort. "It's not easy," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "But we'll make it through. Together." Samuel nodded, looking at the stars above. "I know. I just keep thinking about how this is going to change everything. But I can't ignore what's happening. I need to be there. I need to do this." "You will," Vanessa said, her hand resting on his. "And we'll be here, supporting you, every step of the way." As the night wore on, Samuel realized that this was the ultimate test of his commitment, not just to his career, but to his family. The journey ahead would be difficult, and the road would be long, but he had made a promise to his family, and he intended to keep it. No matter what came next, they would face it together. The arrival in Stanton. The drive from Nashville to Stanton was long and uneventful, a blur of monotonous highways and rolling hills. Samuel sat in the front seat of the family's old SUV, the hum of the engine beneath him a constant companion as the miles stretched on. Vanessa was next to him, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her thoughts as heavy as his. Tyler and Chloe were in the back, both silently staring out of the windows, lost in their own thoughts, each one wrestling with the weight of the change that had been thrust upon them. Samuel had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his emotions, to focus solely on the task at hand. But this felt different. The decision he had made wasn't just about duty or responsibility. It was about breaking the comfortable, predictable life they had built together. As much as he had tried to prepare them, tried to convince himself that this was for the greater good, deep down, he knew there was no going back. He had promised his family a life of stability, and now he was taking that away from them. "Almost there," he said, breaking the silence, trying to keep his voice steady. Vanessa nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She knew as well as he did that the real challenge was only just beginning. As they neared Stanton, the landscape shifted. The wide, open fields of Tennessee gave way to narrow, winding roads that cut through dense forests and steep hills. The town itself was smaller than Samuel had expected, quaint, almost rustic. The main street was lined with small shops, a few churches, and an old courthouse that looked as though it had been there for generations. The houses were older too, simple, with weathered paint and overgrown lawns. It was a stark contrast to the suburban sprawl of Nashville, and the change felt jarring, almost isolating. The town felt suspended in time, like a place that had not seen many changes in decades. Samuel wasn't sure if that was comforting or unsettling. There was something undeniably charming about it, but something about the quietness felt off-kilter, like there was an undercurrent of tension waiting to bubble up to the surface. "Welcome to Stanton," Vanessa said dryly as they turned onto their street, her tone revealing the strain she was feeling. She had been the one to keep the family together through all of this, coordinating the move, making sure the kids had what they needed, and trying to keep their spirits up. Now, it was her turn to face the unknown. The house they had been assigned was small, a modest 2-story home that sat on the edge of town. It was nothing like their home in Nashville. No big backyard for the kids to play in, no neighborhood filled with familiar faces. The yard was sparse, just a few patches of grass and some overgrown shrubs. The house itself had a certain rustic charm, but it felt lonely, disconnected from everything they had known. "Well, here we are," Samuel said, forcing a smile as he looked at his family. "Home for now." Vanessa didn't respond. She was already looking at the house, her mind likely running through all the things she would need to do. Unpacking, finding a place for the kids to go to school, adjusting to this new, unfamiliar town. Tyler and Chloe, though, didn't share the same enthusiasm. They were sitting in the back seat, staring at the house with something between disappointment and disbelief. Samuel could see it in their eyes, the sadness, the longing for the life they had left behind. The kids slowly climbed out of the car, their faces downcast as they surveyed their new surroundings. "I don't know about this, Dad," Tyler muttered under his breath, kicking a rock in the driveway. "It's so different." Chloe, normally more optimistic, didn't say a word. She was looking around at the other houses on the street, noticing how small and quiet everything seemed. This wasn't what she had imagined when they talked about new adventures. This felt more like a retreat, an escape from something. Samuel watched them with a deep sense of helplessness. He had hoped that time would ease the transition, but he could already tell that it wouldn't. The challenge of this new life wasn't just about the unknown dangers in Stanton. It was about the slow erosion of everything they had held dear. And there was no quick fix for that. Vanessa placed a hand on his arm, offering a small, reassuring squeeze. "It'll get better, Sam. We just have to give it time." "I hope so," Samuel said, looking at her. He knew she was trying to reassure him, but he could see the same unease in her eyes that he was feeling. Time would tell, but part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this move was only the beginning of a much darker, more complicated journey. The following days were spent settling in. Samuel's first few hours in Stanton were dedicated to getting the lay of the land, meeting with local authorities, assessing the situation, and setting up a command center for the operation. The town had a strange atmosphere, quiet, almost suffocating. There were rumors swirling about the underlying tensions in the area, whispers of something brewing beneath the surface. No one was saying it outright, but Samuel could sense the unease in the eyes of the locals when they spoke to him. He was an outsider, a stranger intruding on their world, and they didn't trust him. In the meantime, Vanessa worked tirelessly to get the kids settled. She found a local school for Tyler and Chloe, though it was much smaller and more rural than what they were used to. The students were a tight-knit group, and the teachers were friendly but wary. She also had to adapt to her new role in a local clinic, where she would start working part-time, helping to cover shifts for the town's small medical staff. Though she was grateful for the opportunity, it wasn't the same as the hospital in Nashville. The town's medical infrastructure was outdated, and the resources were scarce. By the end of the week, it was clear that things weren't going to get easier anytime soon. Samuel was starting to feel the strain of balancing the demands of his operation with the emotional turmoil at home. The situation he had been sent to manage was growing more complicated by the day, and his mind was constantly pulled in 100 different directions. He found himself staying late at the makeshift headquarters, poring over intel and trying to piece together what was really happening in Stanton. The operation was shrouded in secrecy, and Samuel knew he was only getting half the story. One evening, as he walked back to the house after a long day, he noticed something strange. A car parked across the street, its headlights dimmed. Samuel didn't think much of it at first, but the sight of it made him uneasy. As he walked closer, he saw that the car's windows were slightly tinted, and there was no one inside. It was just a car, but something about the stillness of the night, the way it loomed in the darkness, made him feel like he was being watched. He shook it off, telling himself he was just tired and overworked. But when he reached the porch, he found Vanessa sitting outside, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the empty street. Her face was pale, her expression distant, as though she too had felt the strange unease that had settled over the town. "Everything okay?" Samuel asked, sitting down beside her. Vanessa looked at him, her eyes heavy with the weight of the last few days. "I don't know, Sam. This place, it's not what I thought it would be. It feels wrong, like something's off. I can't explain it, but I feel like we're being watched, like we're not supposed to be here." Samuel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And he was beginning to suspect that whatever it wasn't something they would be able to control. As he looked out at the darkened street, Samuel realized that he had made a choice. He had taken his family to this small, secluded town to confront an unseen enemy, but in doing so, he had placed them in the midst of a much larger storm. What had seemed like a temporary assignment was quickly becoming a life-altering decision, and no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that they would be okay, a deeper part of him knew that this was only the beginning. The heart of the storm. The days that followed the Reed family's arrival in Stanton grew heavier with each passing moment. The stark contrast between the serene, almost idyllic appearance of the town and the palpable tension in the air was unsettling. To Samuel, the dissonance became more pronounced with each visit to his command center, where he worked long hours with a team of officers and specialists sent from Nashville to help him with the operation. Despite their expertise, something about the case felt off. Information trickled in slowly, but no one seemed to have the full picture. The people of Stanton were friendly enough on the surface, but their guarded expressions and careful words revealed the deep-seated wariness they felt toward the newcomers. There were rumors of illicit activity happening in the town, whispers about a criminal syndicate operating from the shadows. Drugs, human trafficking, corruption. But these were just rumors, whispers carried by word of mouth, all of which seemed to fade into the background as the people of Stanton remained tight-lipped. Samuel, however, could sense the undercurrent of fear beneath their polite facades. He could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact when he walked into stores or cafes. He could feel it when he'd show his badge and watch people stiffen, their smiles fading, as if they were suddenly reminded of something they didn't want to acknowledge. Something that they feared. And it wasn't just the locals. The law enforcement officers Samuel was working with seemed equally distant, almost reluctant to engage. Some were eager for guidance, others simply going through the motions, their eyes hollow, as if their faith in their own system had already been eroded. Vanessa, too, was struggling. She had found work at a small local clinic, assisting a doctor who seemed more interested in reading his medical journals than speaking to her. The staff at the clinic was small, the work was monotonous, and the community's medical needs far exceeded the resources available. What had once been a fulfilling and meaningful job at the hospital in Nashville now felt like a hollow replacement. There were no support groups, no camaraderie, and certainly no opportunities for career advancement. It wasn't the life she had envisioned when she had first agreed to the move. Still, she tried to make the best of it. She threw herself into helping the people who came into the clinic, giving everything she had to her patients. But the quiet isolation of Stanton wore on her. She had never been one to shy away from change, but this wasn't change. This felt more like exile. Tyler and Chloe, though outwardly adjusting, were also wrestling with their own personal challenges. Tyler, who had once been the quiet, thoughtful child, now spent most of his time in his room, scrolling through his phone or playing video games to block out the boredom of small-town life. Chloe, who was always the more sociable one, struggled to make friends at her new school. The students in Stanton were a tight-knit group, and despite Chloe's outgoing nature, she felt like an outsider. Every day after school, she would come home with a new story about how the other kids had stared at her or whispered behind her back. For all their efforts to adapt, Samuel knew that the ripple effect of their move had already started to wear them down. But the hardest part for him was the constant nagging feeling that something larger was unfolding in Stanton, a storm that was already gathering on the horizon. He had been briefed on the operation, but the full scope of it remained unclear. His role was to lead the task force, to bring in the criminal elements that had been identified as a threat to the town. Yet the more he dug into the case, the more elusive the truth became. One morning, Samuel sat in his makeshift office, staring at a bulletin board covered in red strings and maps, trying to make sense of the scattered pieces of intel that had been collected. The walls were lined with reports, photographs, and mugshots, all connected by hastily drawn lines and annotations. The town of Stanton, once a quiet and unassuming place, was now the epicenter of something much darker. The intel suggested that a criminal syndicate had taken root in the town years ago, slowly building its influence over the local economy, law enforcement, and government. Drug trafficking was the primary activity, but human trafficking, money laundering, and extortion were also part of the network. But what troubled Samuel most were the names that kept cropping up in the reports. People he knew, people he trusted, and worse yet, some of them were high-ranking officials in the very law enforcement agencies he had come to rely on. As he pored over the documents, a knock on the door startled him. Sergeant Linda Caldwell, a tough and no-nonsense officer from Nashville, entered the room. She had been assigned to assist him on the ground and was one of the few officers who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "Sir," she said, her voice low but urgent, "I think you need to see this." She handed him a thick folder. Inside were photographs of a man Samuel had seen around town, a local businessman named Martin Hayes. Hayes owned several properties, including the town's only hotel, a few storefronts on Main Street, and a large warehouse just outside of town. He was well known, respected even. But in the last few weeks, Samuel had begun to notice him at local events, shaking hands, talking to people, always with that practiced smile. But now, as Samuel flipped through the photos, he saw something else. Pictures of Hayes in places he shouldn't have been, meeting with known criminals from out of state. "This isn't just about drugs," Samuel muttered to himself. "It's deeper than that. Hayes has been pulling the strings." Sergeant Caldwell nodded. "I've been following him for a while. He's got connections, not just to the syndicate here, but all the way up the food chain. And the weird thing is, nobody seems to know how deep it goes. We're missing pieces, Colonel. This isn't just a small-town problem anymore. This is something bigger." Samuel closed the folder with a sense of dread settling in his chest. "We're up against something that has its claws in this town, in the people we trust. It's going to be harder than we thought to pull this off. But we can't back down. We can't let this poison everything." Caldwell stepped back, her eyes filled with concern but also determination. "We're with you, sir, but we need to be careful. The more we dig, the more people we'll lose. And I don't just mean criminals." The word struck Samuel like a punch to the gut. He had already seen firsthand how precarious their position was in Stanton. Every day that passed made it clearer that their presence here wasn't welcome, not just by the criminal elements, but by the very system they were trying to uphold. As the days wore on, Samuel began to realize that the operation he had been sent here to lead was not simply a mission to rid Stanton of criminal activity. It was a battle for the heart and soul of the town itself. One night, as Samuel was driving back from a meeting with local officers, he saw a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man he recognized. A young local, probably in his 20s, who had been hanging around the outskirts of the town. Samuel had seen him several times, always in the background, never speaking up. Tonight, though, the man was standing by the road, his eyes wide, a look of panic etched on his face. Samuel pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down the window. "Hey, you okay?" he called out, his voice cautious. The young man hesitated for a moment, his hands trembling. "They know," he said, his voice low and frantic. "They know what you're doing. You have to stop. They'll come for you. They'll come for all of you." Before Samuel could respond, the man turned and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the night. Samuel sat in the car for a moment, staring into the dark, the words echoing in his mind. They know. Who were they? And how much longer could he protect his family, his team, and the people he cared about before the storm finally broke? The weight of it all hit him harder than ever before. He wasn't just fighting a criminal syndicate. He was fighting a system of corruption that reached into every corner of the town. And as much as he tried to prepare for the battle ahead, he couldn't escape the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Cracks in the foundation. The days began to blur together, and Samuel found himself moving through each one in a fog. The weight of the operation in Stanton had become more than just a professional obligation. It was a personal burden, one that was taking a toll on him and his family. The sense of isolation, the quiet whispers, the constant threat lurking just beneath the surface. All of it was starting to break down the walls he had carefully built around himself over the years. He had always believed that the badge he wore represented something sacred, a symbol of order, of protection. But the more time he spent in Stanton, the more he began to question whether that symbol had lost its meaning. The town, once a quiet, idyllic place, now felt like a pressure cooker, the tension palpable in the air. Everywhere he went, he could feel the eyes of the people upon him, watching, waiting. It wasn't just the criminals who were a threat. It was the very fabric of the town itself. Samuel had never felt this kind of vulnerability before. As a lieutenant colonel in the Nashville Police Department, he had seen his share of dangerous situations. He had dealt with criminals, corrupt officers, and even the occasional violent outbreak. But this was different. In Nashville, he knew the players, the rules, and the landscape. In Stanton, he was surrounded by a web of deceit and half-truths, and it seemed that every move he made only unraveled more secrets, each one darker and more unsettling than the last. One evening, after another long day of meetings with local law enforcement and sifting through reports, Samuel sat at his desk, rubbing his temples in frustration. He had been chasing dead ends for weeks, trying to connect the dots between Martin Hayes, the local crime syndicate, and the high-ranking officials who seemed to be protecting them. The deeper he dug, the more the walls seemed to close in. Every lead he followed brought him to a dead end, or led him to someone else who was just as elusive. Sergeant Caldwell had become his most trusted ally in this, but even she was beginning to show signs of straying. The more they investigated, the more dangerous it became. Their every move seemed to be monitored, every phone call intercepted, and every meeting with local officers was laced with a sense of distrust. They weren't just fighting a criminal syndicate. They were fighting an entire system of corruption that had taken root in Stanton, and it was growing harder and harder to know who they could trust. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. How much longer can we keep this up? The question had been haunting him, but he had no answers. What if the system he had sworn to protect was already too broken to save? Just then, his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Vanessa, a simple message that read, "Come home. The kids need you." A pang of guilt shot through Samuel. He had been so consumed by the operation that he had barely spent any time at home, let alone with his family. The emotional distance was becoming more pronounced. Vanessa had been struggling with the isolation, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for the kids, but he could tell that the strain was getting to her as well. She hadn't said anything explicitly, but he could see it in the way she moved through their home, how she spoke to the kids, how she looked at him. There was a sadness in her eyes, a quiet resignation that he couldn't ignore. Samuel grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The evening air was cool and crisp, the town quiet under the weight of the night. The streets of Stanton were empty, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of a car engine. As he drove toward home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something lurking just beyond the reach of the headlights. His mind kept returning to the words of the young man who had warned him, "They know what you're doing. They'll come for you." Samuel didn't know who they were, but every instinct he had told him that the threat was real. When he arrived home, Vanessa was sitting on the porch, her arms wrapped around her knees, gazing out at the darkened street. She didn't look up when he got out of the car, her face drawn with exhaustion. Samuel walked up to her slowly, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of the night. He could feel the distance between them, even though they were only a few feet apart. "You okay?" he asked softly, sitting down beside her. Vanessa looked up at him, her eyes tired but sharp. "Are you okay, Sam? Really?" Her voice cracked slightly, and Samuel felt a pang of guilt. She was trying to hold it together for the sake of their family, but he could see the toll it was taking. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Vanessa. This whole thing it's not what I thought it would be. I can't trust anyone here. I don't even know who the real enemy is anymore." Vanessa's gaze softened, and she put a hand on his. "I know you're doing your best, but this isn't just your battle. We're all in this together, and we're all feeling it. The kids, they don't understand why we're here. They don't understand why we had to leave everything behind. I don't understand it either, Sam. This place, it's not just the town that feels wrong. It's everything. It's like something's off. Like we're trapped in some kind of, I don't know, a nightmare we can't wake up from." Samuel turned to look at her, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. They were all trapped, but he couldn't bring himself to say it. He couldn't admit that he didn't have the answers, that he didn't know how to fix it. "I can't fix this by myself," he said quietly, the words a confession he had been reluctant to voice. "I've always thought I could, but I can't. And I don't know how much longer I can keep pretending I have all the answers." Vanessa's eyes filled with understanding, and she squeezed his hand gently. "Sam, it's okay not to have all the answers. We'll figure it out together. But you can't do it alone. You have to trust people, even here. You have to trust me, the kids." The final confrontation. The night hung thick in the air as Samuel sat behind the wheel of his car, staring blankly at the darkened stretch of road ahead. His mind raced with the new revelations Sergeant Caldwell had just laid before him. Revelations that had changed the entire scope of their operation. The town of Stanton, which had once seemed like a puzzle he was so close to solving, now appeared to be nothing more than a facade, a small cog in a much larger machine that stretched far beyond the borders of this quiet town. As he drove, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. Every move he had made so far, every piece of intel he had chased, seemed like it had been designed to lead him down a winding path, one that had ended in a dead end. The forces pulling the strings in Stanton weren't just local criminals. They were powerful, deeply entrenched players in the state government and law enforcement, people who knew how to hide in plain sight. This was no longer just a battle for justice. It was a battle for survival. The drive back home felt longer than it ever had before. The sense of dread that had been steadily building inside him was now a gnawing anxiety, one that threatened to overtake his every thought. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed the house was unusually dark. The lights were off, and the silence seemed louder than it had been when he left earlier that evening. Samuel hesitated for a moment, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. Vanessa's words from earlier echoed in his mind. "Something's not right, Sam." He pushed open the door and walked inside, calling out softly, "Vanessa, Tyler, Chloe." There was no answer. He moved through the house, searching each room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. His heart began to pound harder, the silence now an oppressive weight, the feeling of unease growing with each step. As he reached the living room, he saw a faint light coming from the kitchen. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows on her face. When she looked up, there was a deep, undeniable sadness in her eyes. "Sam," her voice trembled as she spoke, and he could hear the fear that laced her words. "I didn't know where else to go." Samuel's stomach twisted with concern. "What's going on? Where are the kids?" "They're fine," Vanessa replied, standing up to embrace him. Her arms were tight around him, and for a moment he felt the strength of her embrace pull him from the edge of panic. "I got a visit today. Someone came to the clinic." She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "A man. He said he had a message for you. He told me that if you don't stop what you're doing, the people you care about are going to get hurt." Samuel pulled back slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What kind of message? Who was it?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He wouldn't say his name, but he knew everything about us, our routine, the kids, even you. He said that you'd be making a mistake if you didn't leave Stanton." Samuel felt a cold chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a threat to his career, it was a threat to his family. And whoever was behind it knew exactly how to get to him. They can't know, Samuel said, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable determination. They can't hurt anyone I love, not after everything we've been through. Vanessa nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. What do we do now, Sam? How much longer can we keep running from this? Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. I hear their words. I don't know how much more I can take. Samuel took a deep breath, fighting to steady himself. We've been running too long. I can't do this anymore. We need to confront this head-on. It's the only way. But even as he spoke those words, the reality of the situation settled like a heavy weight on his chest. He had no illusions about the danger they were in. Whoever was behind the threat wasn't just a criminal. They were an organized, sophisticated network that had already infiltrated the very fabric of Stanton, reaching into the government, law enforcement, and now even his family's life. Every step he took was a step deeper into enemy territory. Samuel knew what he had to do. It wasn't enough to just expose the criminals and their corrupt allies. He had to eliminate the threat to his family and his team. And that meant taking down the people who had been hiding in the shadows for so long. Let's gather the kids and go, Samuel said, his voice resolute. We're leaving town. Tonight. Vanessa looked at him, her eyes full of worry, but also a spark of hope. You think that will keep us safe? I don't know, Samuel replied, taking her hand. But we have to try. The next few hours were a blur of frantic packing, hurried goodbyes, and last-minute preparations. Tyler and Chloe, still too young to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, were confused but followed their parents' lead. The tension was palpable in the air as they loaded their belongings into the family car, the uncertainty of the future hanging over them like a dark cloud. As Samuel got into the driver's seat and started the engine, he glanced at Vanessa, who was sitting beside him, her face pale and drawn. Her lips were pressed together in a tight line, but he could see the fear in her eyes. The road ahead was unknown. They had no destination in mind, no safe haven to run to. But there was one thing Samuel knew for sure. They couldn't stay in Stanton any longer. It wasn't just the threat from the criminals. It was the town itself, the corruption that ran so deep, the betrayal that had seeped into every corner of their lives. As they drove away from the house, Samuel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it, hoping it was news from Sergeant Caldwell, but instead, it was an unexpected number. A single text message. You're too late. They know you're leaving. His heart dropped. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Vanessa, he said quietly, we're not leaving. Not yet. What do you mean? Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. We're being watched. We need to confront this right now, before it's too late, Samuel said, his mind racing. He couldn't run anymore. They couldn't just drive away. The people behind this weren't just going to give up. Before Vanessa could respond, the sound of screeching tires broke the night's silence. From the shadows, a black SUV came speeding toward them, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. Samuel's heart raced as the car skidded to a halt behind them. The engine roared, and a group of men in black tactical gear spilled out, moving with the precision of a military operation. They found us, Samuel muttered, his voice grim. Vanessa's eyes widened in terror as the men approached, their faces obscured by masks. What do we do now? Samuel reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his gun. Stay down. Don't make a sound. Before he could fully react, the door of their car was yanked open, and one of the men grabbed him by the collar, pulling him roughly out of the vehicle. Another grabbed Vanessa, forcing her to the ground. The leader of the group, a tall man with cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. We've been waiting for this, he said, his voice smooth but menacing. You should have left when you had the chance. Samuel fought back, pushing the man away, but the others quickly restrained him. What do you want? Samuel growled, struggling against their grip. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, the leader replied, pulling a gun from his belt. "This is the end of the line for you, Colonel. For all of you." Just as Samuel braced himself for the worst, the sound of screeching tires echoed in the distance. A flash of blue and red lights illuminated the dark highway as Sergeant Caldwell and a team of officers appeared from around the corner, guns drawn. "Step away from the family," Caldwell shouted, her voice unwavering. The men hesitated, looking between Samuel, Vanessa, and the approaching officers. The leader of the group glared at Samuel, then motioned for his men to retreat. "This isn't over, Colonel. You've made a powerful enemy." With that, they disappeared into the night, leaving Samuel and his family shaken but alive. Caldwell approached, breathing heavily. "We've got a safe house waiting. Let's move quickly." As Samuel looked at Vanessa, his heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the faintest glimmer of relief. They had survived the first wave, but the battle was far from over. He knew now, more than ever, that the fight for Stanton, and for everything he cared about, was far from over.